dear friends and delegates and participants. First of all, I'm truly grateful and honored that I was invited to speak. I am grateful to International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, the 14th conference organizers, for this opportunity. Also to the SAGE Publications, and also to my friends at Calcutta Research Group. I am a friend of Calcutta Research Group, and I'm honored that they thought that I would come and talk about something which I'm still working out in my mind. I'm grateful to Professor Ranabe Samadar. I think it is a kind of, he trapped me for this meeting. I didn't know what I am doing at that point of time when I said yes. And I have a great respect for CRG's work, not merely because of its great collegiality, the collective nature of their work, but also because of its deep commitment to the politics of our time. Like many of you, I'm also a kind of great consumer of their research, and also the kind of, in some sense, perhaps the participant in ongoing critique of social realities that we think are terribly important. And I'm grateful that I'm here today. As I said in the beginning, it is going to be a conversation as far as I'm concerned. And I begin with a story. I myself write poetry, but I think I would start with a story writer, South Asian story writer, Sadat Hasan Manto. I'm sure some of you have read him. I'm also quite confident that some of you may have read him in original Urdu. And this is, in fact, the birth centenary year of Sadat Hasan Manto, who grew up in colonial India, subsequently migrated to Pakistan. I won't call it forced migration. I think he moved to Pakistan and wrote some of the very moving and deeply interesting and profound stories about partition. And the story that I'm going to begin with is the one which Professor Samadar also mentioned, called Toba Tek Singh, a story which was written in the 1950s. And the context of the story is the partition of India. The story begins with the post-partition, couple of years following the partition, in a lunatic asylum in Lahore. And in that particular lunatic asylum, following the discussion between government of India and government of Pakistan, it was decided that some of these mad people who are in this lunatic asylum, the Hindu mad people, must come back to India, and the Muslim mad people living in India must be transferred to Pakistan. That's how the story begins. I don't want to talk about the whole story, but in that story, there is this character who is called Bishan Singh, a Sikh from Punjab. He's also described by the name of his city that he comes from, called Toba Tek Singh. Often he's described by his inmates as Toba Tek Singh. And different characters react to this decision that they would be shifted from that particular place to another place. And the story writer, Sadat Hasan Manto, talks about how different characters react to this news. One of them climbs up the tree and says that he doesn't want to be in Hindustan or Pakistan, but he wants to live on this tree. And somebody, Bishnu Singh, who for 15 years in that lunatic asylum, who hasn't slept for all 15 years, a landowner, nobody knows why he came there. And he also reacts quite, if not violently, but he's quite agitated about this news. And he keeps on asking people where Toba Tek Singh is. Is it going to be in Pakistan? Is it going to be in Hindustan? In India or in Pakistan? And on a particular day, he along with others were taken from Lahore asylum to the border, the Wagha border in the northern part of India. And on that border, he hears that Toba Tek Singh, his town where he comes from, is in Pakistan. And he refuses to come to Hindustan. He runs towards the other side of the border. And he didn't budge. And this is how the story ends. And I want to read a passage for you. In the pre-dawn peace and quiet, from Bishnu Singh's throat, there came a shriek that pierced the sky. From here and there, a number of officers came running. And they saw that the man who for 15 years, day and night, had constantly stayed on his feet, lay prostrate. There behind the barbed wire was Hindustan. Here behind the same kind of wire was Pakistan. In between, on that piece of ground that had no name, lay Toba Tek Singh. I think there are many ways in one can read that story. And there's a reason why I began with this story, because that in between land, that no man's land, I think is very important for the story that I'm going to tell today. It can also be read as a story highlighting the pointlessness of territorial partition, or some might say the tragic consequences of partition. One can also say, perhaps the story itself conveying different conceptions of territorialities and movement, and territorialities' attachment and effect, the constitutive effect between land and movement of people. Because Toba Tek Singh, Bishnu Singh is both Bishnu Singh and Toba Tek Singh together. And his attachment for Toba Tek Singh, as the story writer tries to highlight, outweighs his attachment towards the emerging nation state called Hindustan. There is a different conception of loyalty. There is a different conception of attachment. One can also see there's an underlying rejection of the dominant narratives of territorial nationalism, and that no man's land, as it were, the Archimedean point on which you could launch a critique of territorial nationalism and its consequences, its pathologies. And you can see in that act of lying on that ground, a refusal on the part of people to participate in the growing narratives, powerful narratives of nationalism. One can see that story, in some sense, creating that space in between, as if that in-between space between nations is what is important to launch that critique against a very different kind of nationalism or territorial conception of nationalism. What would have happened? Bishnu Singh heard that his parents, his daughter, has all moved to Hindustan because he meets a friend who comes to the asylum and says that, look, your family has already moved to Hindustan. I'm sure when they moved to Hindustan, they must have gone there as a refugee. And also, the story can be read as a story of loss, a depiction of a history, a chunk of history, to use Hannah Arendt's evocative phrase, a time out of joint. Or, to use her another very provocative term, very powerful term, the nationalist triumph paradoxically includes the moments of dark times. Dark times defined as the obscuring of public life, not seeing, not understanding, as I said, fully a time out of joint. And this is a term actually I find quite fascinating while thinking about refugees, thinking about forced migration, thinking about individual experiences of people moving from one place to another, is the dark times, which Hannah Arendt borrows it from Brecht and uses it in such an evocative way and powerful way. And a refugee, a potential refugee, at the very moment of an action, the very action of lying down, a denial that carries strong elements of affirmative about something else, which the story doesn't tell us. The story doesn't tell us about the in-betweenness, but the story suggests that only from that in-betweenness, which I think much of the refugees' lives are all about in-betweenness. Who else recognizes that in-betweenness better than the refugees, better than the people who are forced to move from one place to the other? But who is this figure called refugee? What kind of figure is she? Is she a liminal figure? Is she a temporary entity? If you look at the 20th century between World War I and II, much of the narratives before the First World War and after the First World War, thinking of refugee problem as a temporary problem, which can be addressed either through repatriation or naturalization. Something, a temporary issue, something which can be handled. But the rising number of refugees and the inability of states to repatriate people, or naturalizing inability of states to naturalize people as citizens, created what we consider today as quintessential refugee question or a refugee problem. And this is what was highlighted. I'm greatly indebted to the writings of Hannah Arendt. I'm using it quite a bit in my talk today. She wrote a piece called We Refugees in 1943, almost 70 years ago, and which I think rings so true even in 2013. And she reflects on this question as to who is a refugee, the conditions of being a refugee. Since the publication of that essay in 1943, a lot has been written on that particular essay, We Refugees, which in one sense, quite interestingly and quite ironically, represents, in my reading, a collective voice shot through with individual anxieties that you can read in that essay. In fact, in 1990s, Agamben, who greatly indebted to Hannah Arendt's thinking on abstract citizenship and bare life, made a rightly suggest, I argue, that we should consider refugee to be a central figure of our political history. This is in fact what really Hannah Arendt is suggesting in 1943, that is not an aberration. It is not, refugee is not a figure that you can whisk away. It's not something which you can solve. It's as if it is a condition that confronts us today, and therefore Agamben is right suggesting that's a central figure of our political history. At this disjunction, and that political history, our own political history, if one were to tell that history in terms of disjunctions, in terms of dissonances, in terms of disconnect, one can very well see in that history the disconnect between rights of man, the rights of citizen that Hannah Arendt talks about, created and sustained by the nation-state system. When we talk about forced migration in the context of South Asia, the partition, when you talk about the tyranny of the nation-state system, you also, in some sense, in debt to Hannah Arendt and others, and many others within the context of South Asian political and social thought, those who talked about this disconnect. And I will talk about a bit about that disconnect. And in some sense problematizes. If you look at the Toba Tek Singh story, if you look at the We Refugees, you see, I think they problematize in different ways the connection between territory, state, and nation. I think we ought to remember there's a fundamental distinction between political refugees and exiles. Those who are driven to seek refuge because some act or some political opinion itself is very different from people who became refugees, arrived without means. You can describe them as forced migrants, as a mass phenomenon, emerging largely in the context of Europe in the post-World War I. And we ought to keep that distinction in mind. And when we think refugee as a central character of our history, history depicted as disconnect, as dissonance, as disjunction, it in some sense unhinges. It in some sense destabilizes our own conception of citizen. If people think citizen and citizenship is what very central to our story of modernity and story of our modern history, what We Refugees does as an essay, what Toba Tek Singh does as a story, is to decenter that. Citizen is no more the central category of our times. And in fact, it was Hannah Arendt who describes refugee as one point as the avant-garde of our people. And it is in this context, lying in that in-between no man's land, that in-between space that I spoke about, can react on the territory and imagination of the nation state. It can destabilize the conception of the nation state. It can, in fact, the in-between land, the in-betweenness can in fact reside very much at the heart of the project of nation and nationalism. That's the point I wanted to make. And what the category of refugee destabilizes, as I said, the distinction between man and citizen, nativity and nationality, and the original fiction of sovereignty. This point has been well argued by Agamben. I don't think I can better that, but I think there's something in highlighting some of these points. And why is it that there is a disconnect between man and citizen, nativity and nationality, and the original fiction of sovereignty? I'll talk a little later. Let me stay with Hannah Arendt's essay, We Refuse, a little longer, because I want to tell something about that essay, which I think is extremely provocative and moving. And I take the following things from that essay. Number one, at the heart of the liberal democratic nation-state project, as I said, lies many contradictions and dissonances. And one of the key foundational elements of that project of the liberal state is the inalienable rights of man, the idea of man. That whether you define that source of man as a source of man as the repository of rights, as the defining moment of modern rights. That idea and the idea of citizenship in practice is in conflict. And it is the figure of refugee that not only embodies it, that disconnect. It is the figure of the refugee that in fact highlights the disconnect and shows us that paradoxically there is a disconnect between the idea of man and the idea of citizen in a historical context, and the idea of citizenship, the way we define in our context. And that tension, that abstract man, there's one tension between the citizen and the man. There's another tension between the idea of the abstract man and the people. Sometimes I wonder, while looking at South Asian literature, it is not the word citizen which you find very often used by people. When I say people, if you look at people who undertake social movements, if you look at popular literature, if you look at dissenting voices, the term that is used is people rather than citizen. I used to wonder as to why is it that citizen, the word citizen, is not so popular in the popular writings. I'm sorry putting it so clumsily, but I think the idea is that why is it that the idea of the people is far more popular than the idea of citizen in a constitutional democracy? And one could make sense of that popularity. One could make sense of that why people use the term people rather than citizen. One can see that how there is a disconnect between the idea of man and citizen, and how the people and that abstract conception of man, which is supposed to be the repository of rights. And because people, after all, include many, people is a far more inclusive category than the idea of citizen. And it is something which I think intuitively you find in the writings of the South Asian writings, you find in the literature produced by the social activists, and so on. There's no time to go deep into this liberal, what can be described as liberal aporia, but one can argue that there can be a contradiction between, in some sense, at the fundamental level, contradiction between the state on the one hand and the nation on the other. And this is this contradiction. There are various kinds of contradiction I'm highlighting here. I think this is what I take out from that essay. That essay indicates, it anticipates Hannah Arendt's later work, like Origins of Totalitarianism and stuff like that. But I think this is where, in the context that you have to understand in order to explicate, in order to make sense of the rise of the stateless people. The rise of the stateless people, and what she describes quite interestingly is called state, into the transformation of the state from an instrument of law into an instrument of the nation. And finally, the nation has conquered the state. And this story, finally the nation has conquered the state, is something which is extremely important to remember. And the rise of the stateless people, which happens in the history of Europe and in other places, with denaturalization, in some sense lost the protection of the state. And when you're talking about refugees here, we're not talking about only de jure refugees, but de facto stateless. And as I said, this becomes the issue, and this is what really the context in which refugees were pushed beyond the pale of law. The only way that you could handle, the only way that you could resolve this issue, by pushing refugees beyond the pale of law. Second thing that I take from that essay, the cluster of issues that I take from that essay, that being a refugee, the life worlds of being a refugees, or life worlds connected to a refugee, captured within the narrative of loss. I think we have a huge body of work that talks about, that articulates this narrative of loss. The loss of home, which I think, which is the familiarity of daily life, the loss of occupation, the loss of confidence that we are of some value in this world, we can produce certain value in this world. Loss of language, the naturalness of our reactions, the simplicity of gestures, unaffected expressions of our feelings, as he says. And there's a loss of balance between past and future, between remembrance and a deliberate loss of memory. And where remembering the past has been seen as a weakness. People are constantly, the refugee advised that, look, don't remember the past, think about the future. And because thinking of the past is equated with pessimism, and thinking about the future is connected with optimism, but with a very tragic and paradoxical result, and which Hannah Arendt says that people who proclaim cheerfulness during the day come back and kill themselves. I think she says that, look, they come back and find a creative use of skyscrapers and gas stoves. And between, and she says, in fact, I quote, our proclaimed cheerfulness, she says, is based on a readiness for death. And it is not, at the existentialists would say that committing suicide is an act of freedom, but she turns it around and says suicide is a quiet and modest way of vanishing. So she reflects a lot about that life world. She reflects a lot about the condition. And the last but not the least, the unbearable burden of acting up, playing roles, changing identity as a compensatory move, constantly acting up, constantly identifying with the society that you are migrating to or you are in. As if, and this is all, this changing, constantly changing that identity as a compensatory move. As a compensatory move to compensate for refugees' inabilities to fight for dignity and integrity. As that fight waned, you find refugees are constantly trying to project different identities. And she creates this character called Mr. Kohn, you're familiar with, who is 150% German super patriot, a refugee in Prague, become Czech patriot. In Austria, became an Austrian patriot, all connected to the business of survival. But it's also, and these this kind of acting, these kind of refusing your own identity to be accepted, she acknowledges as a condition of being a refugee. But you pay heavy price in order to be appreciated by society. And that price is you lose the world, as it were. There's a worldlessness that happens when you constantly constantly change your identity. If on the one hand Mr. Cohn is a super patriot, on the other hand, she creates a category which I think is extraordinarily important, is called conscious pariahs. And these conscious pariahs are the guys who wants to highlight a different tradition. It's of course all contextualized within the Jewish story that she wants to tell. She talks about the conscious pariahs, and she talks about Kafka, she talks about Charlie Chaplin, she talks about other characters. Those who refuse to change their identity, those who consciously deny anything else but their own identity. But unfortunately, for both kinds of refugees, on the one extreme, Mr. Cohn and other conscious pariahs, history has outlawed both the pariahs and the upstarts. And let me quote from Hannah Arendt here. And he says that history is no longer a closed book to them, to the refugees, and politics is no longer the privilege of Gentiles. They know that the outlawing of the Jewish people in Europe has been followed closely by the outlawing of most European nations. Refugees, driven from country to country, represent the vanguard of their people. If they keep their identity, for the first time, Jewish history is not separate, but tied up with that of all other nations. The Committee of European Peoples went to pieces because it allowed its weakest member to be excluded and persecuted. In some sense, we refugees, talking about situated experiences, but towards the end, I think she very clearly connects that situated experiences with something which is profoundly universal, profoundly interconnected, profoundly universal. And this is what one would describe as something which a reader of We Refugees would see in the 21st century, that how in certain sense, in different historical context, in different spaces, the refugee refuses to disappear. The refugee refuses to disappear from our that contested political history, that contested political space that we inhabit today. And it is not that she was writing this not because she was trying to, she was, in that essay one gets very clear impression that she was trying to stay clear from pure pessimism, or I should say reckless despair, and between that and blind optimism. And we know from various stories of the forced migration, we know from the context of South Asia and different other continents, that how being a refugee therefore imposes some kind of self-imposed sometimes alienation. And the spaces between individuals, the refugees shrink. And the idea, I think the idea which actually the title of this talk, Intimacy and Distance, this is where it comes to. We all think that intimacy and distance are all opposed to each other. And she actually gives a spin which I'll come to towards the end. But the whole idea is that the conception of society where individuals are standing apart but together. So both the togetherness and the standing apart or distinctive characteristics of individuals are extremely important in that conception of society. And when we think about refugees as people who are stateless and rightless, when you argue for them have the rights, and the fundamental condition in which they lose their rights is because they lose the community, the social world that defines them. And therefore the rightlessness of refugees is not merely the loss of rights, but it's a loss of a home and the impossibility of finding one. And therefore the big question, can a conception of inalienable human rights, big question is then, can a conception of inalienable human rights, universal conception of human rights, protect the refugees? We would think it is. We all talk about human rights, but what conception of human rights we think appropriate that can defend refugees? I think Hannah Arendt actually has some different take on that, which might sound a bit jarring to the defenders of human rights, when she says that the best human rights are the ones, I'm just kind of giving it my own take, are better when they're mediated by national rights. There's nothing called abstract human rights which can really come and defend refugees. And she makes an argument as to why that describing people as human, as something abstract, something outside their own community, itself pushes people into savagery. Because they lose the world, they lose the connectedness. And she says, I think this is a very important point. I think we often think that human rights is all about people who have lost everything. And she argues it is the innocence is the greatest misfortune. It is the loss of rights implies a lack of responsibility. And she sometimes argues that it is sometimes the refugee wants to commit a crime because the refugee wants to be acknowledged, because there's nothing to protect her. There's nothing to acknowledge her. At least criminals are acknowledged, but refugees are not. So in other words, the right to have rights talks about a framework, about a context, about the desire to belong to an organized community, which the abstract nakedness as a precondition of rights doesn't work, because it pushes people to savagery. It wrenches people away from a common world. And loss of human rights in that sense happens when a human being becomes bare, becomes only biologically human, become only abstract. And it's only by not being, it's going above being bare, being abstract, mere nakedness, which actually is the only possibility of granting rights. Rights can only connect when people are actually above, people beyond their abstractness. And there are a lot of things that she talks about I wanted to say, but I have no time. But the only thing I want to talk about in the last 3 minutes is basically about something which intuitively we think when we think about the condition of being refugees. That how, if you are pushed to a corner, if you are pushed to a bare life, when there are a lot of people in history are pushed to a condition like that, how do they react? We think about ketos, we think about fraternity, we think about philanthropy, we think about fellowship, we think about warmth, and we think intimacy is a response to our destitution, moral destitution imposed on people. We think intimacy, that kind of bonding is what is required. I think she makes an interesting point I think I have a lot of sympathy with. And she says that we need intimacy as much as we need distance. And distance here is about your separateness. It's about that in-betweenness that I talked about while talking about the story Toba Tek-Singh. And that distance is all capacity for action and also capacity for opinion. And bonding, extremely important at a time of crisis, but it generates warmth but no light. I have a difference of opinion on that issue, because I don't see that bonding only creates warmth but no light, because there is a very strong cognitive component of warmth and emotion that is generated at a time like that. But if world making is central to the business of living, then the central challenge before us is how much of the world that can be created at a time like that, when the world is actually truly denied to them. That's a fundamental challenge. So today we think of refugees, we think of ourselves. Because citizenship in our times is not only unstable, but constantly changing. And if we argue for rights, we argue for rights not because we are by nature human, or by some kind of anthropological elements which defines who we are, but it's because we are part of a human world where connectedness is, if not the guarantor of our rights, but connectedness is a condition of our enjoying the rights. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.